let's take a second look at the test execution report. We said, even in the beginning of the course, that one of the most important metrics is the HTTP request duration. This is the holy grail. But you can probably also notice one line underneath. But it seems that everything that is in the HTTP request duration is just duplicated one line below. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? But you can also tell that just by looking at the way this is represented and comparing it, for example, to groups or even tags, that it looks similar. And yes, you have guessed it correctly. This is technically speaking a tag on the HTTP request duration metric. This is essentially a submetric, if we can call it like this. And this exists because it filters out any responses that contain errors. But now by default, we expect a response to have a status 200 or something like that, 201, something that indicates that everything has been accepted. Also, status codes that are with 3 are also considered valid because they typically indicate a redirect, which in itself is not an error. Now, why is this important? Well, quite often, a response with an error can be significantly faster than a response that is the result of some processing that happens in the background. So maybe doing some heavy work in the background takes a few seconds, but an error page can be generated in milliseconds. Now you can understand how putting everything inside the HTTP request duration metric is not really a good idea, because if you have a valid request that took 2 seconds and you have one request that only took a few milliseconds, we put them all together, then this metric overall will look much better. So let me show you an example how this works and how we can get actually different values here. So in this example, which you will find as a resource to this lecture, we have here different requests, and we are using Mocky.io, and overall we have a delay of 900 milliseconds, which is less than a second. And we can kind of like see that overall the request duration, looking at the 95th percentile, it is below 1 second, right? So it's kind of like what we expect. Now let's go ahead and change something about this. So I'm going to go here to Mocky.io and I'm going to create a new mock. And here at the status code, this time I'm going to choose here, instead of 200, which is default, I'm going to select 503, which means service unavailable. So this would be essentially an error code. And sometimes applications, when they're offline or when they're no longer accepting requests, just going to send out an error page and going to have the status code 503, service unavailable. It says like, leave me alone right now. I'm not going to respond. And they're doing this very, very fast. So I'm just going to use this new endpoint URL. And we're going to add it here, for example, to the news page. So we're going to assume that the news page is offline. And we're not going to use a delay here because this error page is ideally generated very fast. So we have here, let's say, some other pages which take some time to come back. And we have this news page which is now misbehaving. So what we can do here is we're going to leave this report as it is. So we're going to open up a new terminal. So this is possible here from Visual Studio Code. So this from the second terminal, I'm going to run the exact same test here, but this time we should see a difference. So if we're taking a look here at the HTTP request duration, we're going to see this time that the values between them, they are different, right? So for example, we will see here, even if you're looking at the minimum, right? So we're going to see here we have a different minimum because this also includes the pages that had an error. So the page that had an error was sent back very fast. Also, the average and everything else is pretty much different in terms of this. So this is how these errors that appear can be problematic. So ideally, what we want to do, if we care about actual pages that were successful when they came back, we want to include that. So they will typically take a bit longer, and we want to have this in our metrics. So instead of using HTTP request duration as we have here, ideally we should use this filter. So this is relatively easy to be added. all we have to do is put everything here between quotes so that it is a valid expression. We're going to open and close a curly brace. And then inside here, we're going to use expected response. So we can simply go ahead and copy this entire expression from here and paste it here. So let's go ahead and run it. So this time we're going to see here, we're going to get a check mark here as well. So we're going to see the difference between the normal request duration and the request duration where all the requests have been successful, at least according to our definition, meaning that the response status was between 200 and 399. So essentially something with 2 or 3 in the beginning.